Welcome back to Cloudy with a Chance of Insights. I'm Richard Hogan, and it's just me and Cyrus this week. David is on a very well-earned break before, as most of you following on LinkedIn will know, starting his new adventure at London Heathrow. Now, we're a few days later than usual getting this one out, so apologies for that, but there's a decent amount to get through still. Cyrus has been looking at some Windows and Intune news that I think says something bigger about where device management is heading, plus some interesting research on Apple Watch security and how much trust actually sits between a watch and the phone that it's paired with. From my side, I have GitHub's Fleet Mode in GitHub Copilot. Then there's a study I found on LinkedIn yesterday claiming that you get better results out of an AI if you're rude to it. And to finish, a story out of Melbourne, Australia this week that sounded fake to me on initial read, which is an AI agent that was asked to book a gym class and decided the sensible way to do that was to hack the booking system. Now, if there is a thread running through all of that, it's trust. What we let those things do on our behalf and what happens when they do more than we asked. Anyway, enough for the introduction. Cyrus, I will pass it across to you.
Thank you, Richard. And I wanted to digress today with Apple. I've seen this researcher talking about that on LinkedIn. I fell in love with the research. The problem is, in today's topic, it was more like everything about trust. And the first time I've seen Apple Watch, I was trying to understand how we have this small device that we trust all the time and can access our iPhone. Although the iPhone is really protected, it's a closed environment, I always had in my mind the project of just trying to hack or to penetrate an iPhone through an Apple Watch. And it was in the back of my mind, like I think we all have a lot of side projects or just small projects we have in our mind. And since we have like vibe coding, and now all these projects start to get a life. And sometimes like cool ideas become non-cool ideas. So when I've seen that in practice with like all these brains, I'll mention the names. I had both feelings of, I should have tried it. But when I seen what was done, I was like, no, I could not have done it alone. So it's a team of multiple people. And the researchers was led by a guy called Nils Rollshausen. Sorry if I pronounce the name badly. And he reverse engineered with the team the communication between the Apple Watch and on the iPhone. So they went deeper than just what I wanted to do initially, what's the Bluetooth pairing. So initially I was talking about Bluetooth, how you do the trust. So they went deeper. They reconstructed the protocols Apple used to move messages, health information, and network traffic between the two devices. And most communication is protected inside IPsec. So it's not an easy stuff. But Apple also created a proprietary mechanism on top of standard protocols. One of them uses something called linked director. I think it's linked director messages, to be frank, and to help the watch and iPhone find each other over the Wi-Fi. So they went to that level, and I'll share the link with you, Richard. After I think it's really interesting. There's one diagram I'm watching actually, and it sounds easy, and it's kind of. Once it's done, it's easy to say, oh, it was easy. So now we know it's more scary than it is. So the researchers, they found that these messages could be manipulated in ways that could redirect the watch traffic. They also found weakness, obviously, in an extra encryption layer used for sensitive health information. So it's not just how you can penetrate the iPhone. You can just, basically it's the set of APIs and they get verbals. Right. So once you have access to just like without even hacking anything, just recreating this kind of trust, you can get messages and you have access to those health information. Those researchers stopped short of a complete remote iPhone takeover. The biggest security lesson is more interesting. So that's where I wanted to go. Your Apple Watch is a trusted computer connected to another trusted computer. It sounds like Active Directory a bit, but it has sensors, credentials, private information, Wi-Fi access, that's the main part, and a privileged relationship with the iPhone. So wearables deserve a place in the threat modeling. So, like I'm surprised in 2026, like I'm on like on leave on the weekend, and I've seen that project, and I'm sure it will go in Hacker News at some day because that's very interesting. But I'm surprised that when you do threat modeling, when you talk about bring your own device, we are not talking about those wearable OS. Doesn't matter if it's iPhone or Samsung or any other models. So the research also show the risks created when proprietary protocols become very complex. Standard encryption underneath can be excellent. That's what was shown, while weaknesses appear in the custom layers built around it. And that's more evident with, I'm unbiased here, but it's more evident with like Android. We've seen a lot of things with Android, and iPhone was really proud of, no, we have a proprietary layer and it's safe, which is not. So I'll park this research stuff. You will see it in the link in the description if you're on YouTube. Now going back to my favorite topics, which is Microsoft and Intune. There is a July Intune change that I think many admins will appreciate immediately, and you probably see that, Richard, if you follow me, because I like a lot of those stuff. There's so many news about that now, but if you're not following, there's a sync button finally tells you what it is doing. So there's a thing when you start to do Intune, sometimes you have to do it through a security lens, management lens, whatever pushed you towards Intune. Sometimes to sell Microsoft, because a lot of companies they had on-prem environments. When you migrate to the cloud, you will have to face Intune. There's some people who don't like it, don't understand it. And I had even one client said that I knew iTunes is for music, right? No, Intune. So there's a sync button that is not doing what it's supposed to do. You have a sync button on your device, you click it, and it's just like going to the cloud to check if there's new policies, if it's what you expect from a sync button. But sync button from Intune never did that. It was completely different. So when you press that button in your portal, you could trigger the MDM check-in while parts managed by the Intune management extension follow their own check-in cycle. So that's what I was explaining. That includes things such as Windows 32 apps, scripts, or remediation. So admins could press sync and then wonder why the change was still missing. And that was like, I'm talking about 8 hours or like weeks sometimes. That's not something like was user-friendly. And we had scripts to restart the device from remotely, or there's a lot of things that could be said about this button. And so the new per device sync experience give you progress directly in Intune. So that's not like making the button more like what was expected. That's going beyond. And for whoever listens, sounds like really trivial, but I can guarantee you that's a big news. That's a massive news. I'll make it more appealing than actually a lot of more proprietary solution like what we use, like a Jamf or any kind of solution that you see a progress bar. As simple as that now. So it's very appealing. And more importantly, one action now triggers the MDM check-in, the Intune management extension check-in on Windows, and the compliance check-in. So one action trigger those three. So you are helping the admins a lot. It's making life really easy. Again, that sounds like a small admin improvement. At enterprise scale, it saves troubleshooting time and gives support team much better certainty. But the device has actually received instruction, and you'd have no idea how much ecosystem was built around this. A lot of script, a lot of custom things are built around those things. And dependency to that, Windows 11 26 H2. I was wrong in one of the episodes. I'm not wrong, but in one of the episodes, I was like talking about the H1, which is more a Microsoft Surface ecosystem updates. But now the H2, which is for every Windows, Microsoft is enabling Windows setting backup and restore by default on eligible commercial device. I've talked about that because I was testing it in the private program with Microsoft. We had access to private previews and tests, and we talk to product manager, product owners, and we see if the update is interesting, if it's cool, if it interests our clients. So now it will be live for every device. And I checked this carefully. This is not just limited to Surface devices. It's literally all device. It applies to eligible Windows 11 26H2. So normally you should receive that are intra-joined or hybrid joined. Hybrid joined, I discussed that before. It's going to move to a deprecation mode. I don't think we have this. It's sad. We will be fully intra-joined or something else that I don't want to digress. I'm controlling myself. It can preserve Windows settings and Microsoft Store app information during the device replacement or recovery. So that's we discussed that before. So the endpoint team's device replacements starts looking less like rebuilding user environment. We are just like literally using the restoring mode. It's a different mindset. So you're not reimagining PC. It's more like pushing the Intune mindset of all in one place, and the user can have the files, everything, and the loser device, it can be an empty shell. So it's good. A quick one, another Windows security change I like is ESS. So it's enhanced signing security, and it's expanding to support supported external fingerprint readers. ESS use VBS and TPM 2.0 to isolate Windows Hello biometric authentication. So that's also an excellent news. So with fingerprint readers, the matching can happen securely on the sensor itself with a protected channel backed into Windows. So before you had to use some Windows Hello, you had weakness when you had only the face. It's not necessarily as trusted, or you had different like clients who didn't want that. So now directly through the Windows Hello for Business, you have this kind of trusted layer that you can use. As I said, so before it used to create an awkward choice on many systems, keep the stronger ESS on security channel or use external fingerprint readers. Now you can have all in one place. Sorry, I'm just censoring myself here. Yeah, the last one, I was thinking of Dave for this one, but yeah, today is on break. Every time I talk about Arc, I think of Dave. Azure Arc enabled hotpatch for Windows Server 2025. Now it's fully generally available. Hotpatch updates running code in memory. So most monthly security update can land without a server restart. So if you have a land of Arc-enabled servers, doesn't matter what they are, it can be on-prem too, that's very important. You have now the hotpatch, which you don't need to restart. It's almost like the Linux ecosystem, which is great. It's fully generally available. There's no bugs anymore from what we know. So it's an excellent. Yeah, the rest is just notes. I want to talk about KMS activation with TPM-backed attestation. That's a new thing, but I will not digress on this one now. It's a lot of discussion. When I do my preparation for podcast, I think it will take less time, but actually, I want to digress properly on the subject. So I'm going to park that for another episode, because that's also interesting. I'm sure you did that when you use KMS for a license assignation before. Now you can use TPM. So if you want to check yourself, good. If you're not, I'll talk about that in a different episode.
That's fine. Carry on if you want, Cyrus.
Yeah, so I it's been a few minutes. I'll just read off my notes here. Starting actually in August, Windows Server 25 will begin showing readiness information, so organization can see whether their KMS hosts meet the future requirement. And TPM attestation is planned to become mandatory with the next Windows Server LTSC release. So that's what the enterprise use, or even mid-sized business can be on. I like the principle here, Richard, because event software activation is becoming part of Zero Trust. That's, when I had these notes and I choose my news, at the beginning I was talking about trust, device trust, the hacking of the wearable OS, the sync button, do you trust it as an admin? do you there was no trust, because there's trust between devices technically, but as a human trust there was none. So you had to build an whole ecosystem around that. And again, those old school KMS activations still exist, in enterprise level. There's not everyone necessarily in the cloud. And you teach me that, actually, Richard. I remember when I joined IBM, I was very naive. I was thinking from my previous job, I was seeing everyone rushing to the cloud, but actually you said no, there's a lot of clients still not in the cloud. I'm sure it's the case today for different kind of reasons. So this KMS news interested me because, again, we talk about the zero trust, and that during the zero trust shift, that you should not necessarily just say this is software, this is what we do on-prem, this is what we do in the cloud. You can't do that. If you want zero trust, it's everywhere. It's in your again, I can't just digress. It's everywhere, all perimeter. So.
As I said, I think during the intro, I think trust is running through the theme of everything that we're talking about on this episode, and trust is becoming incredibly important when we're talking about some of the systems that we've now got either access to or that we're currently leveraging. I mean, you mentioned Apple Watch right at the start of the show. Now, Apple have got a relatively good record, or at least reputation, around some of the security elements. Now, I do wonder how much of that is about vendor lock-in and walled garden approach than it is about actually security. But that's a separate topic. And they are, again, in court, I think, in the UK around this whole encryption on the messaging feature. I saw an article on the BBC the other day that said that had reared its head again. When you were talking about that, I'm just sitting here, and I've got a smartwatch on, and it's a Huawei smartwatch. I mean, God knows what that viewpoint would be in some countries like the US, for example, where they'd probably be worried about, or how much data are you sending back to China? And I'm like, seriously, does it really matter? But you look at what some of the things that are coming up, and I'm going back to go to Ignite. Was it Ignite? Where they did Project Solara, I think it was, which was, I don't know if you remember, they had like a little identity badge,
I remember
like an access pass that was basically AI enabled and allowed you to do certain things. I mean, that's taking that to the next level to a certain extent. And then how much down the line are we going to end up having AI assistants that we do trust to go and purchase things on our behalf, and do have the ability to go and spend X amount on our cards and our bank accounts and stuff like that. So yeah, that's going to be coming. And I think that trust is going to be the bedrock that we have to solve in order for this to get widespread adoption. And I think there is, I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent here, but I think there is a difference here between what enterprises and certain software companies think that consumers want and actually what consumers want. And I think there's a difference between the consumer world and the business world. And there, I see a lot of use cases for AI, and I know I've gone on to a bit of an AI tangent as opposed to a trust and security one. But I think there's a lot of use cases in business where AI is going, yes, that works, and then we can do that, and it can help us be more productive, blah, 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 blah. But in the consumer world or real world, that's less of a driver, in my opinion. That I'm still struggling to find a really good use case for AI in my day-to-day life. So there has to be something that ties that all together. And then once we get that, is how do we then secure it? How do we trust that it's not going to do something bizarre? But anyway, yes, a bit of a weird tangent there, I think, from me, even for this podcast, which I will stop before we go down a massive rabbit hole and go from there.
I mean, you can. It's only me.
So, talking of trust, well, my first story, for want of a better description of it, has nothing to do really with trust, apart from the fact that you actually have to trust the agents to do what you've told them to do, which, as we know, is a different thing. So I'm going to start off with something that I found out by accident this week. So I think everybody, I think, is aware of this. that I tend to use the app side of the sort of coding piece than the CLI. So I was working with the new GitHub Copilot app rather than the CLI, as I said. And something popped up earlier on in the week, which was the agent actually asked me if I wanted to turn on something called autopilot fleet mode. Now, I had no idea what that meant. And rather than just clicking yes and hoping for the best, I went and asked Copilot directly what it was actually offering me, which is something that I have a horrible tendency to do. If you see some of my chat history on Copilot, it's usually me asking lots of stupid questions and then it giving me increasingly stupid answers in most cases as well. But anyway, it turns out that fleet mode has been sitting in the CLI at least since April. Now, as I said, I don't really work in the CLI, so quite often these things only come up and make themselves aware to me if I read about them, or, as in this instance, Copilot sort of prompts me to, gives me a nudge, for want of a better word, to say, wait, what about this? Why don't you use this? Now, I wrote a very short piece about this on the blog earlier in the week, and I wanted to go and rehash that a little bit. Because once you strip away the name, the idea behind this is actually fairly simple. So normal Copilot CLI works through a task, one step at a time, one file, one change, and then moves on to the next one. Fleet mode adds an orchestrator on top of that, which breaks your objective into separate chunks of work, then works out which of these chunks depend on each other, and then dispatches several sub-agents to work on them at basically the same time. So each of those sub-agents gets its own context window. They all share the same file system, but they can't talk to each other directly. Only the orchestrator coordinates those sub-engines. So GitHub's own example on their page here is refactoring an auth module, updating its tests, and fixing the related documentation, all in one pass with different sub-agents on each piece. You trigger it, as you would probably expect, by using the /fleet command, followed by the objective. Or, as I mentioned earlier on, Copilot just says, do you want to do this? So if your instructions are vague, it will just run sequentially because there's nothing really for the orchestrator to split apart. So the quality of what comes out of the back of this is pretty much entirely dependent on the quality of the input that you put into it, which I think is sometimes where I might come out relatively in front on this one, because I don't know, Cyrus, I can't remember whether I've talked about my workflow on this, but I tend to actually work through a series of agents to define what it is that I want, basically create a big spec or a PRD or whatever you want to call that document, and then I give that to the coding agents, which in theory makes that decomposition a lot simpler and a lot easier to for the agents to manage. Anyway, importantly, it does appear that these sub-agents share a single file system, so with no file locking. So in effect, if two of them write to the same file, whichever one of those finishes wins. And that is typically, as from what I can tell, done silently with no errors or merge conflicts raised, just an overwrite that might not be immediately noticeable. The fix, as far as I can tell at the moment, is to partition your prompt so each sub-agent owns distinct files, or at least route anything shared through a single agent right at the end of the chain. And the sub-agents also can't see the orchestrator's conversation history, so anything they need has to be in the prompt or in a file that they can read directly. So I've only been using this basically since yesterday, so I'm not going to give a verdict on whether fleet mode is good, bad, indifferent, whatever, after one session. So that would be a little bit premature. What I will say is if it actually cuts down the time of development or the development cycles, that could be a good use case, especially for those that try and do things in parallel as much as they can do. The thing that I want to understand a bit better, and this will probably go over time, especially with the change to GitHub Copilot's billing model, which is actually how the token use is going to be on the sub-agents. Now, I couldn't see any evidence from the GitHub documentation whether they've actually looked at whether this is more effective than running one agent across multiple individual tasks as opposed to multiple agents over the same estate, for want of a better description. But I think there'll be something that I'll need to keep an eye on over the next few days to see whether there is an impact on that. Because speed basically is only a win for me if the cost per unit of work actually comes down. or as opposed to perhaps potentially going up. Now, continuing on that trust theme, and the next two I actually found on LinkedIn, which has been a bit of a surprise this week. So there's two things that have come up on LinkedIn. First, both of which I will point out, I thought might well have been fake stories when they came up. And literally, I've got LinkedIn open on my main screen here, and the same news story just picked up. So I'm sure everybody's probably aware of one of these by now. But anyway, somebody shared an article on LinkedIn earlier this week referencing a study that supposedly showed that being rude to your AI assistant gets you better results. So, as I said, my first instinct was that this probably is either not true or has been overhyped and a bit sensationalized, standard sort of LinkedIn clickbait these days. But I actually did go and have a quick look at the paper. So it is a real paper. It's a bit narrower in focus than I think the LinkedIn post indicated. So the underlying paper is called Mind Your Tone, Investigating How Prompt Politeness Affects LLM Accuracy by Om Daria and Akhil Kumar at Penn State. And it was posted, the first version was posted in October last year. Oh. So they built a data set of 50 multiple choice questions across maths, science, history, and rewrote each one in 5 tones, from very polite through to very rude, giving them about 250 prompts in total. They basically ran all of that through GPT-4o and used paired t-tests to check whether the difference were actually meaningful. Accuracy went from about 80% on the politest prompts up to 84.8 on the rudest. Small, but as I found out helping my daughter through a statistics module in university last year, that is a statistically significant variance. And every meaningful difference in the paper favoured the less polite end of the scale. So I should say clearly that original paper was basically just on one model with a fairly small data set. And nothing here was tested specifically on coding tasks. So this is more of like the sort of general sort of chat interface. So to go from, this helped GPT-4o pick the right better on a history question to swear at your coding assistant is doing a lot more work than the original paper suggested. There is a corollary, for want of better words. So there was another paper done in 2024 that actually said that on older models, so GPT-3.5, the actual effect was flipped. So the more polite you were, the better responses you were getting from that study. So just to bring this full circle, the same 2 Penn State researchers went back and did a much bigger follow-up study in May this year, which is what the articles that I found were pointing to. So that included expanding the model basis, so GPT-4o, GPT-5 Nano, a couple of Gemini Flash variants, and they increased the questions to a 570 question subset. Their conclusion is that there is still a little bit messier than be rude to your AI. They found that some models barely move at all with tone, but others swung quite a bit. And it does vary by subject as well. So the actual takeaway is probably more of a warning than anything else. It basically does mean that depending on the model, and I've seen this myself, you will get different results depending on how you, in inverted commas, talked to the model. Now, I don't know, Cyrus, whether you've seen this or not, but where you get the chain of thought being displayed within GitHub Copilot or Bob or, Claude Code or whatever else it is, I will notice, I don't know whether you have or not, that it will say the user is rightly upset or the user is furious, yes, or the user is really angry. So it's obviously picking up on that tone. And the fact that it's noticing that, in my head at least, is indicating that it's taking consideration around the user sentiment. Now, whether that makes the response any better is a completely different story, but it is obviously able to pick up and understand, based on either tone or the language that's being used, that something is going wrong and the user is losing trust or faith in the underlying model or the agent that it's going on with. So I don't know. I've got no empirical evidence to say that within coding assistance, at least, that changes one iota. But it does indicate at least that the agents have been aware of some of these things. Now, I'm not going to sit here now and start swearing at Copilot on the strength of that paper, but it is something to be aware of. Now, my final piece this week is, again, a slightly more tangible, trust-related, I suppose, here. And again, this is something that I found weirdly on LinkedIn. I think it was yesterday. And again, when I first read it, I was like, this must be another bit of fake news here, because it just sounded a bit too neat and, again, clickbaity. But anyway, it turns out it's actually true. So ABC News in Australia reported this yesterday, I think. And multiple outlets have actually picked it up since and corroborated it. But basically, a Melbourne man, referred to in the reporting as Andrew, who works for some AI product company, was using OpenClaw. And he asked it to book him into a popular morning gym class. Apparently, within minutes, it told him it had managed to book classes weeks, and in some cases months, further ahead than the gym's own interface allowed. So that limit apparently only existed on the front end and wasn't enforced in the underlying APIs at all. Now, again, I don't know about you, Cyrus, but I've seen that issue quite often, is that the enforcement is put at the front end, not necessarily at the back end. So if you bypass the front end and just go directly to the back end, you can quite often get different results than if you were going through the front. I don't know whether that's a flaw, but it just is a reminder that you should put some of these checks in the business logic, not just in the front end. But anyway, to be clear on this one, the agent found and used that gap before Andrew asked it to do anything of the sort. So this was one of those, OpenAI, Anthropic ones where the agent did something autonomously that wasn't specifically asked to. Apparently, Andrew then asked whether it would be possible or whether it was feasible or something along to be moved up a separate waitlist he was fourth on. So there's obviously some sort of waitlist for this course that he wanted to attend. So the agent went and tested the API rather than just telling him no, and found there were no authorization checks stopping one user from cancelling somebody else's reservation. Though without being told to, it cancelled the person sitting in position 1 and reported back, apparently, that the API had, quote, zero authorization checks on cancelling other people's reservations, wow, and that Andrew had moved from 4th to 3rd, so therefore higher up that waitlist. Apparently, the guy asked whether he could undo it, but it couldn't. And it's not clear whether the person removed would have had to rejoin the waitlist or whether this was actually resolved and they got their place back. Now, a security researcher, Florian Roth, did sort of push back a little bit on this on X, just saying that it's slightly misleading because Andrew did sort of ask the question about whether he could be moved up in the queue. So in effect, it's not quite as autonomous as the first step, because it did sort of, point the agent at the problem and give it enough of a hint to sort of justify the second step. Which I think is probably, in my opinion, a fair challenge. However, I think that first step, I think, is still the interesting one, where it's gone and done something without specifically being asked. And again, that does sound very reminiscent to me of all the recent stuff we've had with Anthropic, OpenAI, and I think Meta from last week. Now, there's another question here, which I think is an interesting one, which comes down to liability. I mean, basically, who is responsible for this? Because is it the person who did made the request? Is it the model? Is it the people that made the model? Is it the security company that didn't really secure the website correctly? Who knows? And that is a big, messy problem for future people to worry about. But what I think is the takeaway that I'm thinking from this is how simple that request was. It might be, especially now we're using things like whisper flow or voice commands into this. It might have been just, me thinking aloud going, oh, I wonder if it's possible to do X and Y. You don't necessarily expect the agent that's listening to this to go ahead and necessarily do what you're doing. So there is a certain amount, I think, of responsibility here with the users as well as with the system. But anyway, that wraps up my 3 topics for this week, Cyrus. And we ended up sort of on a security topic, even though not really traditional security areas. But that is the world that we live in at the moment, I think, and will continue to be the case for the foreseeable future, I suspect.
You also made me feel less guilty. Every time I was rude to my AI. I was always afraid also someone, if it's Copilot, if it's Bob, because it's governed in the enterprise, so you can see, some admin can see what you say. But even when I was with my own version, like of Claude or ChatGPT, whatever, I felt guilty every time I was getting rude. I was like, I know it's a robot, but I was like getting upset. But I felt the answer was more accurate. I was impatient. And yes, I've seen in the in the chat how the user is very becoming impatient, la la la. So now you find scientifically evidence. 4.5% is it's indeed a lot. And it's a proof that actually we should stop being polite with those AI agents.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I remember when it first sort of became popular, and there was a trend. Is that the right word? Where people were saying, actually, don't be polite to the models. I don't know if you remember this.
I remember.
Because obviously, if you're putting please and thank you on there, that's extra X amount of tokens that you'll send into the to the underlying model. So from a token usage perspective, you should be as concise and as brief as you possibly can do in your interactions. So no unnecessary words. I mean, they tend to get stripped out anyway, but you don't want to be giving more information to the model than you actually don't need to give to get the task done. But now it's interesting that there might well be enough intelligence there to understand when they need to pull their finger out and get a right response because the user is getting frustrated and rude. Who knows? This is all a big learning curve for everybody, I think, and we'll find something else that we need to worry about next week.
Perfect.
So I think that wraps it up for us this week. David should be back with us to regale us all with his stories about his first week or so at Heathrow. And I'm sure some more topics from Microsoft Research or one of his other popular sources. And thank you for listening. Please do like, subscribe, follow, etc. on whatever platform that you are joining us from. And we will see you in 2 weeks' time. Thank you very much.